Picture the Colosseum on a sweltering afternoon in 80 AD. 50,000 Romans pack the stone seats, their voices rising in a thunderous roar. The morning animal hunts have ended. Blood and sand mix on the arena floor. Now comes the midday spectacle, the Ludi Meridiani, when the real horror begins. A woman is dragged into the arena. She's stripped naked, a deliberate humiliation designed to strip away every shred of dignity before death arrives. Perhaps she's a prisoner from one of Rome's endless wars. Maybe she committed a crime. Or perhaps she simply angered the wrong person in an empire where power meant everything and human life, especially enslaved life, meant nothing at all. What happened next in Rome's arenas, gladiatorial schools, and throughout the empire's brutal slavery system reveals a darkness that even the Romans themselves sometimes struggled to defend. This isn't the story of noble gladiatorial combat you've seen in Hollywood films. This is the story of what Roman entertainment culture, combined with the systematic dehumanization of slavery, did to captive women. And it was, in many ways, worse than death itself. When we think of Roman gladiators, we picture muscular men battling to the death with sword and shield, but women fought in the arena too. The evidence is sparse, but undeniable. A marble relief from Halicarnassus shows two women, identified by their stage names Amazon and Achillea, engaged in combat. They wear minimal armor, fighting bare-breasted, equipped with swords, shields, and leg guards. An inscription notes they were released while still standing, suggesting neither died in that particular bout. Historical texts confirm their existence. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote that in 63 AD during Nero's reign, many distinguished women disgraced themselves by appearing in the arena. The poet Juvenal mentioned female gladiators training with the same intensity as men. The Roman Senate passed laws in 11 AD and 19 AD, specifically forbidding upper-class women from fighting as gladiators, regulations that point to the practice's actual occurrence despite social disapproval. The social backgrounds of these fighters varied. The vast majority of gladiators, male or female, were enslaved people or prisoners of war. Scholar Anna Miochewska suggests that female gladiators were primarily slaves who had committed crimes. Others appear to have been free women, overwhelmed by debt, who sold themselves into servitude. A few upper-class women fought for thrill or notoriety, scandalizing Roman society. Female gladiators were exotic novelties, advertised by sponsors as special attractions to wow crowds. Scholar Alfonso Mañas suggests that physical appearance likely played a significant role in selecting female fighters, pointing to the sexual dimension of their performances. They fought each other, people with disabilities, and occasionally wild animals. In a society where respectable women remained covered from head to toe, the bare-chested appearance of female gladiators in the arena carried obvious erotic overtones for male audiences. The absence of ancient accounts describing female gladiators dying in combat may suggest they were typically forbidden from fighting to the death, potentially making them expensive living curiosities rather than expendable combatants. Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiators entirely around 200 AD. According to the historian Cassius Dio, after a gymnastic contest where women competed fiercely, jokes were made about other distinguished women, prompting Severus to forbid any woman from fighting in single combat. The real horror for women began not in the arena, but on the battlefield. Rome was built on conquest. For centuries, Roman legions marched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, crushing resistance and enslaving entire populations. War captives served as a primary source of slaves throughout the Republican era and into the empire. When Roman armies conquered a city or territory, the fate of captured women followed a brutal pattern. Under the Ius Gentium, the law of nations, victorious armies had the right to enslave defeated populations. Historian Flavius Josephus recorded that when Titus captured the city of Jaffa during the Jewish War, he killed all the men and sold 2,130 women and children into slavery. After the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, tens of thousands of people were enslaved, flooding the markets. Jewish slaves could be purchased at Hebron or Gaza for the price of a horse. These weren't abstract numbers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters torn from their homes and sold like livestock. Some were sent to work in mines where survival rates were abysmal. Others became agricultural slaves, laboring in chains under brutal overseers. Many ended up in urban households as domestic servants, and still others, particularly young women, were funneled into Rome's thriving sex trade. Under Roman law, enslaved people had no legal personhood. They were property. Masters could subject them to corporal punishment, sexual exploitation, torture, and summary execution without legal consequences. The adequacy of their food, shelter, and medical care depended entirely on their perceived utility to owners whose whims might be cruel or occasionally humane. Enslaved women faced all these horrors with an additional dimension. Their bodies were assets to be used, rented, or sold for sexual purposes. For women captured in war, enslavement often meant prostitution. Roman authors made clear that the sexual lives of enslaved people were routinely exploited to serve the desires of the free. Owners could and did have sex with their slaves as they wished. No consent was possible. No refusal was permitted. Romans who could afford it purchased sex slaves rather than visiting public brothels, creating a system of private sexual exploitation on a massive scale. For those destined to fight in the arena, the journey led to a ludus, a gladiator training school. These weren't schools in any modern sense. They were fortress prisons where human beings were broken down and rebuilt as weapons of entertainment. The largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, built by Emperor Domitian in the 1st century. Connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel, it could house hundreds of fighters. Archaeological surveys of gladiator schools reveal their true nature. Trainees slept in tiny cells measuring roughly 32 square feet, housing 1 or 2 people. Even in Pompeii, evidence suggests 4 men were sometimes crammed into spaces designed for 2. These weren't dormitories, they were cells in what archaeologist Wolfgang Neubauer describes as a prison. They were prisoners. The compound at Carnuntum in Austria shows the full picture. The entire facility was walled with only 1 gate leading out. Inside were training areas, cells, an infirmary, and the instruments of brutal discipline. Gladiators, whether enslaved or free volunteers, were shackled when not training. They swore an oath, recorded by Seneca, to endure branding, chains, flogging, or death by the sword. Training was relentless. From dawn until dusk, under the supervision of former gladiators called doctores, they learned to kill and be killed with professional efficiency. They practiced with wooden weapons heavier than real ones to build stamina. They attacked the palace, a 6-foot wooden pole perfecting strikes and defensive maneuvers. Gradually, they progressed to actual weapons, learning the techniques of their assigned gladiator class. The goal wasn't just physical skill. Trainers instilled mental toughness and acceptance of death through psychological manipulation, public humiliation, and forced witnessing of executions. Gladiators lived with the knowledge that they might die at any moment for the entertainment of people who viewed them as barely human. Women who entered these schools faced all these horrors with an added dimension. In a world where enslaved women's bodies were routinely sexually exploited, the gladiator school offered no meaningful protection. The lanista who owned the school controlled every aspect of their lives. The hierarchical structure of these establishments, combined with Roman attitudes toward enslaved people and those classified as infames, the infamous, created conditions where abuse would have been both possible and, based on broader patterns in Roman slavery, likely common. To understand what happened to captive women in Rome's entertainment system, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Sexual assault was an omnipresent feature of Roman slavery. Scholarly consensus is clear on this point. As one study in Springer Link states, sexual assault was a regular experience for Roman slaves, both male and female, whether or not they were formally exploited in the sex trade. There was never a slave in the Roman Empire who did not experience slavery as a relationship of violent domination and general dishonor. For enslaved women, this meant living under the constant threat and reality of rape. Masters had unlimited sexual access to their slaves. Same-sex abuse by male masters of male slaves was also common, particularly of young boys who were forced to depilate and grow their hair long to maintain a youthful appearance well past puberty. The famous freedman Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon speaks of his sexual service to his master as an expected part of his enslaved youth. Enslaved women working as prostitutes faced systematic serial assault throughout their lives. Even those who achieved fame as professionals and were eventually freed and enriched never escaped, as scholars note, the anguish of a life of serial assault and the stigma of enforced bodily exploitation. In the context of gladiatorial schools and arenas, this exploitation would have intensified based on the available evidence and what we know about Roman social hierarchies. Gladiators, actors, and prostitutes were all classified as infames, infamous people with severely limited legal rights. Romans assumed that actors, dancers, and gladiators were sexually available, and the boundary between fighter and prostitute was blurred. Both sold their bodies for the entertainment of others. For female gladiators and enslaved women in the arena system, the combination of their enslaved status, their classification as infames, and the documented sexual exploitation throughout Roman slavery points to a grim reality. Based on how Roman slavery functioned more broadly, they would have faced not just combat training and potential death, but likely ongoing sexual exploitation. The lanista who owned them controlled their labor and, following broader patterns in Roman slavery, would have had the power to exploit them sexually or rent their services to others. Wealthy patrons may well have demanded sexual services as part of the entertainment package. In a society that viewed enslaved people as objects without rights, resistance was impossible, and complaints were meaningless. The historical record leaves most of this exploitation unrecorded in detail. We know it happened because Roman legal and literary sources discuss the sexual use of slaves as an unremarkable fact of life. What we don't have are the voices of the women themselves, their experiences erased from history, just as their personhood was erased under Roman law. If training in gladiatorial schools was horrific, arena executions reached levels of cruelty that shocked even some Romans. The midday executions, held between morning animal hunts and afternoon gladiator combats, showcased the empire's most creative brutality. The most infamous method was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Criminals, prisoners of war, and other condemned individuals were thrown into the arena with wild animals trained to attack and kill them. This wasn't gladiatorial combat. These people weren't trained fighters. They were victims in a one-sided slaughter designed for maximum spectacle. Women were executed this way too. Criminals of both sexes faced the beasts. The poet Martial describes watching such executions during the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD. The condemned were sometimes tied to poles, unable to run or defend themselves, while lions, leopards, or bears were driven into a maddened frenzy by arena slaves cracking whips. But Rome took its cruelty further. Executions were staged as mythological reenactments, transforming murder into theatrical entertainment. Scholar Kathleen Coleman has extensively documented how condemned criminals were forced to act out myths, with their real deaths serving as the finale. One particularly horrific reenactment involved the myth of Pasiphae, who mated with a bull and gave birth to the Minotaur. The poet Martial, writing about the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD, explicitly describes witnessing this performed in the arena. He writes, "Believe that Pasiphae was mated to the Cretan bull. We have seen it. The old legend has won credence." Scholar Kathleen Coleman, analyzing this passage, suggests that if such a reenactment actually occurred as described, the condemned woman would have been dressed in a cowhide and, based on how trainers controlled animal behavior, likely smeared with the scent of a cow in heat to induce the bull to mount her. What followed would have been a fatal sexual assault by the animal, causing massive internal injuries and death, all performed for the entertainment of thousands of spectators. Another myth reenacted was that of Dirce, who in mythology was tied to a bull's horns and dragged to death. In the arena, condemned women were forced to play this role, tied to the horns of a rampaging bull and dragged across the sand until they died from their injuries. Historical sources suggest that Christians were sometimes forced into these roles, though the specifics varied. The Christian writer Tertullian raged against these spectacles in his treatise On the Spectacles, describing how condemned people were forced to portray gods and mythological figures, their deaths transforming myth into grim reality. He wrote of criminals castrated to play the role of Attis, of bodies burned alive to reenact the myth of Hercules, of prisoners mauled by bears while dressed as Orpheus. The people subjected to these executions were called noxi, the harmful ones. They were criminals convicted of serious offenses against the Roman state. The list of capital crimes was long: treason, rebellion, desertion, arson, murder, rape, theft, and many others, but the severity of punishment depended entirely on social status. Roman citizens, especially those of the upper classes called honestiores, faced relatively merciful deaths if convicted. Beheading was quick. Exile preserved life. But the lower classes, the humiliores, along with non-citizens, slaves, and prisoners of war, faced degrading public executions designed to humiliate and terrorize. Women could be noxiae just as men could. Female criminals, prisoners from rebellions, Christian martyrs refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods, all found themselves condemned to die in the arena. Their gender offered no protection. If anything, it added an extra dimension of sexual degradation to their suffering. Some executions used the method of ad gladium, death by the sword. But in the arena, even this became a spectacle. Sometimes condemned prisoners were paired, one armed and one not. The armed prisoner killed the unarmed one, then was disarmed and killed by the next armed prisoner, creating a chain of deaths that continued until the last one standing was finished off by a professional. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows that executions were so common they decorated homes. Mosaics depicting damnatio ad bestias have been found in Roman villas, suggesting wealthy Romans enjoyed seeing images of condemned people being torn apart by animals even in their private spaces. The sheer scale is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over the centuries, died in Roman arenas. They included gladiators who fell in combat, but the majority were noxiae, condemned prisoners who died in midday executions while crowds ate lunch and waited for the main gladiatorial event. Why did Romans create such elaborate, cruel spectacles? The answer lies in Roman values around social hierarchy, citizenship, and power. Public executions served multiple purposes. First, they deterred crime through terror. Watching someone torn apart by a lion or dragged to death by a bull sent a visceral message about the consequences of defying Roman authority. Second, they demonstrated the power of the emperor and the state. The emperor controlled not just the lives of subjects, but also their deaths, deciding who lived, who died, and exactly how that death would unfold. Third, and perhaps most importantly, executions reinforced social hierarchies. by making the condemned appear less than human, by stripping them naked, forcing them into degrading roles, and killing them in ways that destroyed all dignity. Rome separated the condemned from the spectators. The crowd could feel morally superior, grateful for their own citizenship or freedom, reassured that as long as they obeyed, they would never face such a fate. For enslaved people watching these spectacles, the message was even more pointed.
This is what we can do to you. Your life belongs to us. Your body belongs to us. Your death, when it comes, will be exactly as brutal in public as we choose to make it.
Women faced additional degradation. In a society where female modesty was highly valued for respectable women, forcing condemned women to appear naked in public was a profound humiliation. Sexual violence against condemned women, whether through assault by animals in mythological reenactments or through routine exploitation by guards and arena staff, served to completely strip away personhood and humanity. While direct evidence for the full extent of this abuse is limited, the combination of Roman attitudes toward enslaved people, the documented sexual exploitation inherent in slavery, and the degrading nature of arena executions suggests a pattern of comprehensive dehumanization. The arena wasn't just about death. It was about demonstrating absolute power over human bodies and destroying any claim to dignity or autonomy that the condemned might have retained. All of this horror was legal. Roman law not only permitted but facilitated the systematic exploitation and brutal execution of enslaved people and non-citizens. Under Roman law, slaves were property, not people. They had no rights. Masters could beat, torture, rape, or kill their slaves without legal consequence. The only restriction was that masters couldn't waste their investment too carelessly, but even this was more about economic pragmatism than humanitarian concern. The distinction between honestiores and humiliores meant that identical crimes received wildly different punishments based solely on social class. A wealthy Roman convicted of murder might face exile or a fine. An enslaved person or poor non-citizen convicted of the same crime faced death in the arena. For women, the legal situation was even worse. Roman law gave fathers and husbands enormous power over women in their households. A woman caught in adultery could be killed by her father or husband without penalty if done in the heat of the moment. Enslaved women had no protection whatsoever against sexual assault. This legal framework meant that captive women who ended up in the gladiatorial system had no recourse. They couldn't complain about abuse. They couldn't refuse sexual demands. They couldn't object to being trained as fighters or executed as criminals. They existed in a state of absolute powerlessness, their lives and bodies completely controlled by others. The few protections that did exist applied only to citizens. Prosecuting someone for assaulting an enslaved person was like prosecuting someone for breaking their own property. It simply didn't happen. And in the arena, where thousands watched condemned people die in elaborately cruel ways, there was no notion that these deaths were wrong. They were entertainment, justified by the victims' crimes or their status as non-citizens and enslaved people. The gladiatorial games and arena executions lasted for centuries. They began in the 3rd century BC and continued through the height of the Roman Empire. But eventually, they ended. The rise of Christianity transformed Roman values. Early Christians condemned the arena as bloodthirsty murder, opposed to their teachings about the sanctity of human life and the equality of souls before God. When Christianity became the state religion under Constantine in the early 4th century, attitudes slowly began to shift. Constantine officially banned gladiatorial games in 325 AD, though enforcement was inconsistent across the empire. The remaining gladiator schools were closed by Emperor Honorius in 399 AD, but executions in arenas continued for some time after, and various forms of spectacle persisted well into the Christian era. What finally ended the spectacles wasn't a sudden moral awakening, but a combination of factors. Christianity provided an ideological framework that opposed them. Economic decline meant fewer resources to maintain the elaborate games. Barbarian invasions disrupted the supply of prisoners and animals. Gradually, the empire that had thrived on spectacle crumbled, and with it went the arenas. The women who suffered and died in Rome's gladiatorial system left almost no direct testimony. Their voices were never recorded because enslaved women weren't expected to speak, and their experiences weren't considered important enough to preserve. What we know comes from fragments, legal texts treating them as property, medical writings discussing their bodies, literary accounts from spectators who watched them fight or die, and Christian writers condemning the whole system. But the evidence is clear. Captive women in Rome's arena system faced not just the threat of death in combat, but systematic sexual exploitation, brutal training conditions, public degradation, and executions designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. They lived and died as objects, their humanity denied by the very legal and cultural systems that claimed to represent civilization itself. The story of women in Rome's gladiatorial system is one that history has largely forgotten. We remember the Colosseum as an architectural marvel. We admire Roman law as the foundation of Western legal systems. We study Roman military tactics and political structures. But we often look away from the human cost of Roman entertainment and the systematic dehumanization at the heart of Roman slavery. The women who died in Rome's arenas, who were raped in gladiator schools, who were sold into slavery after their cities were conquered, who were forced to fight for the entertainment of crowds that saw them as barely human, these women deserve to be remembered. Not as abstractions or statistics, but as real people who suffered real horrors in a system that valued spectacle over humanity. Their story reminds us that civilizations can achieve great architectural, legal, and military accomplishments while simultaneously perpetrating systematic brutality. It challenges us to look critically at how societies treat their most vulnerable members, because how we treat those with no power reveals our true values far more than monuments and laws ever can. If this deep dive into the dark side of Roman history has fascinated you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Codex of History for more revealing looks at the untold stories of the past. History isn't just about the famous and powerful. Sometimes the most important stories belong to those whose voices were silenced, whose names were never recorded, but whose suffering shaped the world we inherited.